Welcome everybody. I'm Noah Schultz-Bayard, the SA Director at the Australia Institute. I'm filling in today for Ebony Bennett, the Australia Institute's Deputy Director, who is the usual host of our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. Ebony has passed me the digital reins, so to speak, for these webinars for the next little while as she takes a well-earned break. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Kaurna people on the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet wherever you are across Australia. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. So during the pandemic, the Australia Institute is aiming to do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and the times that we host them does vary. So please make sure you're subscribed at tai.org.au/webinars so that you don't miss out. And just a few tips to help things run smoothly today. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panelists, and you can also upvote other questions and make comments on other questions from other guests. There's also a chat function. Please keep things civil and friendly and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. We haven't had to boot many people out, and it's normally actually my job to be in the chat area, making sure you're all behaving yourselves. Today, Hayden's doing that job, and he'll keep a tight eye on you, so be friendly in the chat would be great. A few people have complained that the notifications popping up from the chat window can be a bit distracting. If you're finding that, I think the best thing to do is to click on the chat, and there should be an option to pop it out into a separate window, and then you should be able to move that to the side of the screen so that it won't get in the way so much, and hopefully that helps. And finally, this discussion is being recorded. We'll post it on our website, and a copy will be sent out to everyone who is in attendance. I think that's all the housekeeping. So now on to the topic of today's webinar. And I thought it might be interesting if you cast your mind back, all the way back to the 1st of February this year. That was when the decision was initially taken as a result of COVID-19 to close Australia's borders to visitors from mainland China. That policy was then extended to close the border to all foreign nationals on the 20th of March. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that feels like it all happened about 100 years ago. And over the century that has been the year 2020, COVID-19 has had an extraordinary impact economically and culturally across the world. Many sectors in Australian society have suffered because of the decisions that had to be taken to protect our health and that of the community. And our universities are certainly among those who are feeling the greatest impact from the COVID restrictions. The decade from 2009 to 2018 saw an unprecedented boom in international student enrolments. And as a result, education is now Australia's largest service-based export, which contributes $37.6 billion directly and indirectly to the economy in 2019. Universities Australia has estimated that due to COVID-19, $16 billion in revenue will be lost over the next 3 years. So today, we'll be talking about all of that and much more with our panel, who I'm thrilled to introduce now. Professor Brian Schmidt is Vice-Chancellor, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Australian National University. Professor Schmidt is one of Australia's most eminent scientists and the winner of the 2011 Nobel Prize in Physics, alongside many other academic awards and distinctions. Professor Schmidt has spent most of his academic career as an astrophysicist at the ANU Mount Stromlo Observatory and Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics before becoming the Vice-Chancellor of the university. Professor Andrew Norton is Professor in the Practice of Higher Education Policy at the Centre for Social Research and Methods, also at ANU. He is recognised as one of Australia's most respected and experienced higher education policy thinkers, researchers and commentators. Prior to joining the university, he was Higher Education Program Director at the Grattan Institute. Before that, he worked at the Centre for Independent Studies and advised 3 Vice-Chancellors at the University of Melbourne. And finally, we have Dr. Richard Dennis, who is the Chief Economist at the Australia Institute. Dr. Dennis is probably familiar to many of you who are joining us today and is a prominent Australian economist, author, and public policy commentator. He's also a former associate professor in the Crawford School of Public Policy. Welcome to you all, and thank you for being with us today. Firstly, Professor Schmidt, if I could start with you, I thought it would be great if you could give us a bit of an overview, a state of play for the Australian university sector and the effect that COVID-19 is having on the ground in our country so far.
Great, thank you, Noah, and thank you for your acknowledgement to country. Those of us here in Canberra on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. Yeah, the Australian higher education situation really is a story that goes back more than a decade, as Australia, more than any other country in the world, started bringing in larger and larger numbers of international students as part of the offerings that we do. And this was a situation that was sort of done out of mutual convenience with government. It wasn't really planned. But the reality is visa terms and conditions, the policy environment with a funding of domestic fee freezes, a lowering of research funding in real terms, all contributed to universities realizing that they could bring literally 1 million students a year to Australia. And the fees that they pay, and they typically pay at a group of 8 in excess of $40,000 per annum, which sounds like a lot to an Australian, but compared to the US, it's actually kind of, it's a bargain basement price. So it depends on which market you're in. And we've created sort of an equilibrium where a very large fraction of the money that universities have to do strategic activities, often research, but also, outreach activities and things is being funded from international student fees. The Australian university system has been very effective at this. I think there have been, of course, issues around large numbers of people migrating into the center of cities and infrastructure, but there's also huge economies. People are pretty high skilled, low cost labor. And so there's a really interesting ecosystem that's developed in Australia. And as I said, it's almost $40 billion a year in 2019 of export income. That is a lot of money. It's 2.5% of the nation's GDP. And that doesn't even include all the research and the spillovers the research does. So it's not been perfect, but it has been something that has helped power the Australian economy, and it's been one of the more diverse types of things that Australia has done. But at the beginning of 2020, as you say, on the February 1st, the world changed pretty quickly. Many of the students are unable to come. We're not seen right now as being very competitive compared to, for example, the UK and Canada, despite them having huge COVID outbreaks, especially in the UK relative to us. The reality is they're open, and students actually care more about open campuses than other considerations right now. And so we're looking at sort of a step change of funding decrease for the universities over the coming 5-10 years would be my guess. But it is sort of accelerated what I think is a geopolitical risk, since we're extremely reliant, it turns out, on Chinese students, especially in the group of 8. So that is something I think we've all been mulling over. And the reality is what we're seeing is probably the risk that was 5 years out, it's been brought forward. And I personally don't think we're going to resolve this easily. I think this is a step change in, for example, the total number of international students that universities are going to have. ANU 2 years ago made a decision to cap our numbers to be a certain size institution because we thought from an academic perspective that would be best. We started last year, and so we restricted our numbers last year. Probably not perfectly timed from my perspective because I lowered my numbers and then I had COVID-19 come in and dramatically lowered the numbers. And so other institutions that were continuing to grow, University of Sydney grew their international student population dramatically last year. So they've lost students just like we have, but they are also way up. So other institutions are in a bit better place than we are. But I also think that we need to adjust to this new normal. But Australia also has to come to terms with not just how we teach our own students and what academic environment do we want. We also have to come to terms with the research. The reality is Australia has probably had a third of the research that the nation does paid for by the students of a strategic rival. And that I don't think is sustainable long term. And we need to think a bit about how we come into a new equilibrium. We're the only nation in the world that does this. So I think that's a good overview. We're also going to want to talk about students and packages like that. That is another thing. But
Yes.
Andrew can get into the nitty gritty on that.
Great, thank you for that intro, and we'll circle back to talk about what may be, the longer term implications of the changes that we're going through. But yes, Andrew, I might come to you next. It's important to talk in this context that we're living through now. The government policy impacts the way that the universities function, and just recently legislation affecting the sector passed through the parliament, and that was despite opposition from Labor and the Greens. It's a complex package, but the most well-known part of it is that it will reduce the cost for some courses, such as teaching, nursing, math, science, and engineering, while increasing fees for some other courses, including arts, humanities, and the law. Can you please explain, first of all, what the effects of the package are in total, but also what the effect of that may be for universities and students?
Well, it's got several, as you said, complex elements. So the reductions in student contributions are designed to steer enrollments towards supposedly job-ready fields, as you're suggesting, and it's a financial incentive, and they presume that student choices will change and that university behaviour will change as a result of that. I think the difficulty with this is that most of the literature and the experience of previous decreases in student contributions is that it doesn't have a big impact on student decision making, that students are driven by their interests first and foremost, and within those interests, most likely to go for a course already that they think has relatively good job prospects. So the changes in student contributions are not fundamental, I think, to the decision making. The weird part about job-ready graduates is that at the same time as doing these changes student contributions, it's taken an analysis of university teaching and scholarship costs done by Deloitte Access Economics and made that the basis of the new overall funding rates. So that's the student contribution plus the Commonwealth contribution or the tuition subsidy. And what that means is in key fields like teaching and nursing and science and engineering, universities are actually going to get less per student under job-ready graduates than they do under the current system. And so my big concern would be that the most price-sensitive partner to this transaction, universities who are in the midst of a huge financial crisis, may actually make decisions that are perverse from the point of view of both public policy intent and the university's own missions. My view is that universities will try hard not to do this, but the reality is they're getting less money per student on average in total under this new package. And therefore the scope to do these kind of swings and roundabouts, so we lose money on arts, but make it on science and it all evens out in the end, that is going to be much, much harder to do. And so over the medium term, the logic is if you haven't got economies of scale or some other reason why you've got high costs in a field, that you might move away from that and concentrate on the fields where you can actually cover real costs and make a small surplus.
So it
The
may
other
have
aspect
a
of that
profound
is-
impact, really.
Yes, the other aspect is, it's flowing on from Brian's point about research. So I agree that probably about a third of research is funded by international students. But probably about 10% is funded on earnings from domestic students, most of which comes from their Commonwealth supported students. And so I would estimate that would probably halve under job ready graduates. And so at the same time as you've had this huge hit to research revenue via the international students, you're getting another smaller but still substantial hit in losses from domestic students. So even if job ready graduates was a good idea in some sense, which I don't actually think it is, but even if it was, the timing is spectacularly bad that you get two serious hits to research at the same time, slightly alleviated by an extra $1 billion for 1 year only next year in the budget of earlier this month.
No. Sounds very concerning, and I should acknowledge, as one commenter pointed out, that it wasn't just Labor and the Greens who opposed, it was also Jackie Lambie opposed to that in the Senate, though the government still had the numbers to get it through. Important to acknowledge that, and thank you for pointing it out. Richard, I'll come to you now, and I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us about the importance of the university sector to Australia from an economic and financial standpoint, just so we can get a sense of how serious the impacts could be here.
Yeah, look, as Brian's already alluded to, the university sector is a huge contributor to the Australian macro economy. It is a big employer of people in its own right. It trains an enormous number of people each year who come out of the university sector and work in the broader economy. It's an enormous source now of export revenue, because so many people historically, not this year, have been coming to Australia to effectively consume our education services. People coming here to study is, from an economic point of view, no different from them coming here for tourism purposes or buying our iron ore off us. It's people from overseas, leaving their money behind effectively in exchange for us giving them something valuable. So the enormity of our higher education sector shouldn't be underestimated, and its centrality to our economy shouldn't be underestimated. But the problem is, and I'm not talking here about ANU or a university, I'm talking about Australian public debate for 20 years, we're not quite sure what the purpose of a university is. Individuals might think they know what that purpose is. I'm not saying Brian doesn't know what his vision for the uni is, but as a citizen and as a taxpayer, is the purpose of a university to train a student to go and get a job? Or is the purpose of a university to help a citizen learn what they're passionate about and go out and not just have a richer life, but participate differently in the economy because of it? Or is the purpose to train up the workers that some employers need in 4 years' time? Or perhaps most concerningly, is the purpose of all that study to make a massive profit off the back of foreign students and domestic students, to actually make an enormous surplus of cash in order to fund some research that we collectively think is important? Because there's a big difference between educating young people, or people, educating them and training them at different tasks, pretending we know what jobs will be needed in 5 years' time or 10 years' time is just ridiculous. Like, I've taught economics at ANU. I'm pretty confident there's not a single economist at ANU who would say, oh yes, we have the tools to anticipate what skills employers will need in 10 years' time. Just to be clear, when I did my undergraduate degree, there was no broadband internet and no smartphones, and no one trying to help young people in 1988 had any idea what the future looked like. Well, guess what? No one at any university or no one in any employer group knows what skills we'll need in 10 or 15 years' time. So there's this kind of fool's errand that we're trying to make everyone job ready for the jobs of the future. That's a lie. That's a lie that we tell students. Perhaps it's a lie we tell governments. But I think a bigger concern is the idea that the best way for Australia to fund foundational important research is off the back of profits made from students paying, Australian students paying very high prices for some of these degrees.
Mm. That leads us into, Brian, I wanted to ask you, we received some questions before the webinar, too many to go through now, but we can synthesize them into, I think, three main concerns that people held around the trajectory of the university sector, around increased reliance on international students, increased casualisation of the workforce, and a sense of corporatization of a need for a pursuit of profits. Can you address your position relating to those areas of concern that are definitely out there, and the way that COVID is affecting those relationships?
Yeah, well, it's certainly COVID is running a shock through things. Now, I'm probably the worst vice chancellor to address these things from the status quo, because I'm completely the one that rebels against these things. I'm the university that has limited our students, despite it costing money, because it impacts on the academic experience that our students get, whether they're from overseas or domestic. So I do worry about all universities going down the same path. Universities ultimately are instruments of public good, but the policy environment here has really driven us to be copycats, imperfect copies of each other, in an all having to, good all looks the same. And we need places like ANU that are relatively small that, advance the future of philosophy. Do we need 39 universities advancing philosophy at the leading edge? Probably not. Do we need research-led education? Yes. Do we need all, 2 million students getting a research-led education? No. Do we need lots of people going in and bearing down for 4 years and getting an education that allows them to think critically, to be able to take information from disparate sources and adapt to whatever the world throws? Yes. Do we need every single person in Australia to do that? It would be good, but the reality is not everyone's made to do those types of things. So we need a heterogeneous environment, okay? And so casualization makes no sense for ANU, and I am trying to get rid of it. Just to be clear, 7% of our total expenditure on salaries last year was casualized workforce. It's a small amount, and it's going to get smaller in the future as I try to strategically have that human capital be connected long-term to the university. That's good for our students, it's good for our staff. So yeah, I have real problems with the casualization. But if you're trying to mass educate people at the lowest possible cost, I'm still not convinced casualization is a strategic way to do it, but it may be the low cost way to do it. You can see why it does exist in places. And the whole corporatization of universities, well, if you really want to mass educate people, there is some reason to corporatize things, but you don't want every university to be like that. We do need research-led education for some people, and people who get it. I know it's always seemed like that they have a real advantage in life. In Australia, it's not at all clear that they do. People who do professional degrees like engineering, law, they actually get higher salaries than physicists in this country. And that's not necessarily true in the United States, but it's true in Australia, right? And so I guess we need to really figure out how to create this ecosystem that is, can deliver inexpensive education, quick training for those where it's appropriate, long-term critical thinking for those people who will benefit from that. But, a lot of people don't want to spend 4 years learning about critical thinking. That's not where they are in life right now. But I think more importantly, and not discussed, is sometimes people at 25 or 30 and 35, especially in this very rapidly moving world, they do need to have the opportunity to come back and get a reset of their education. And our system's not good at catering really to them. Most of those people find it financially quite challenging of how to do that. And so I think we really need to think about what education and research needs to look like for the nation and design a system rather than patch what is kind of a crappy system. And we're just patching a crappy system right now.
Interesting. Andrew, I wanted to ask you, and Brian, you mentioned in there research and the important role that it plays. Andrew, where is research funding sitting at, and how is government regulation and policy affecting research funding?
The government directly pays for about a third of all the research done at Australian universities, but possibly has a disproportionate impact beyond its third of funding. So for example, the research support program, the main block grant that universities receive for research, it's based partly on your performance on sort of getting competitive grants like Australian Research Council, but also on your industry income. And so that really incentivizes universities to do research, which is more at the applied end. And so the big trend we've seen over the last 30 years is that applied research is now much bigger than basic research, which is the reverse of what it was 30 years ago. And so it's not that basic research has declined in absolute terms, but in a growing system, applied research is now the principal activity rather than basic research. And I guess the question is, with this loss of discretionary income from international students and less extent from domestic students, will it be that more basic research that suffers disproportionately? That because the government wants the universities to do applied research, it's been this discretionary funds that have supported basic research. And so the cuts may not fall equally across all research activities. So that's one of the real dangers here. There are also questions about, the competitive grants like the Australian Research Council, where success rates are very low. Probably 1 in 5 people who apply actually get a grant. Are we wasting lots of time and energy on grants that go nowhere? And actually the government's going the wrong direction, that maybe more of this money should just be attached to students and be driven in a very low bureaucracy way through the system. And universities can decide, given their own local strategies and needs, how best to spend the money.
Interesting. Richard, earlier in the year, you wrote an opinion piece. This was kind of as COVID was really starting to bite and universities were having to make decisions about how they were going to respond to this crisis. You wrote an opinion piece looking at the different ways that universities were responding in terms of staff and capital and savings and investment. Could you please flesh out a little bit what you had to say there?
Yeah, look, I mean, it goes to the earlier point I made, I suppose, that we're not quite sure what the point of our universities is. And again, I'm distinguishing individuals don't have a strong view about the point from we as a community don't have an agreed position. So often universities are now talked about and talk about themselves as if they're businesses. Now, everyone knows the point of running a business is to make a profit. But when you make a profit, what you do is you post checks to your owners called dividends. So if I run a profitable company sitting at a table making tables, if I can sell my tables for more than they cost to make, I've got a profit at the end of the day, and I literally post that profit to someone, the owners. Well, the thing with public universities is they're owned by us. We own them. So kind of what's the point in a university making a profit? Who's it going to post the check to? If we charge students more than it costs to give them a degree, if we accumulate a surplus, what do we do with the surplus? Well, we can post it back to the government, which would be odd because unis are usually saying they need more money from government, not want to give money back to them, or we can stockpile that cash and we can sort of grow a big mountain. And you often hear universities say, well, we're trying to build up these reserves so that one day we won't have to rely on governments. But think about that. What that means is we're accumulating a surplus at the expense of today's staff and today's students, in the hope that if universities build a big enough mountain of cash, one day future taxpayers won't have to pay for universities. Like, why would we do that? Why are we so desperate to reduce fees in the future? Why are we so desperate to reduce taxes in the future? So, again, I think Australia is genuinely lucky to have Brian at the helm of ANU, and I don't doubt for a minute that ANU has quite a different strategy in this regard to most universities. But when we look at the university system as a whole, COVID came along and really wrecked a particular business model. But that business model needed some wrecking. I mean, unless the unis can clearly articulate to what end they want to make a surplus out of today's students, is it to fund research that will help other people in the future? Is it to make fees lower in the future? Like, what's the point of racking up billions of dollars in surpluses? That business model never made any sense, I think, for publicly owned institutions. And while the crisis has been terrible for universities and university staff and lots of students, and there's no doubt that this government, in, for example, refusing to provide JobKeeper, has gone out of its way to put pressure on the unis, those underlying questions of what do we want our university system for, what do we want it to do, who's it there to serve, those questions need answering with or without COVID.
Did either of our other panelists want to respond to that, Brian?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say the surpluses are largely short run, in my opinion. That is, they end up being translated into future expenditure. There's a couple year lag as these things go. I think it's fair enough to say that most vice chancellors see the excesses to be spent on research. Why? Because of rankings, and I can't put it any simpler than that. And I don't like that. And rankings are one of these things where you kind of shrug your shoulders as a vice chancellor, and you hate them. But the reality is, if you go backwards in them, everyone notices it. And I can tell you, as someone who has basically said, let's not optimize to rankings, let's optimize to our mission and assume that the rankings will eventually figure what right is out. I'm taking a big risk right now, because I'm telling you, everyone says, oh, they don't matter. But I can tell you, you get calls as soon as you go backwards, and you do.
It sounds a bit like how politicians say that they hate the polls and they don't look at the polls, but we all know that they do, because they're quite important.
So so if I can be honest, the surplus on a given student, so the excess money that you get from a given student, is entirely, not entirely, largely focused at increasing rankings and to do other things. So I think it's worthwhile for me to talk about what I do with surpluses at ANU. Yes, I do help fund research, but I'm also helping fund things I can't get money for. Indigenous programs, providing scholarships for people to relocate in Australia. Australia is almost unique within the Anglo world, where no one moves. There's no support for people to help people change away from going to the university right next to them. And so I have been putting a lot of money into providing people of talent who don't happen to live in Canberra to come to the National University. And we do that in the form of an endowment, although we typically ask for philanthropists to do it. So we are converting a little bit into a long-term program, because I think, there are, in the language of an economist, rents right now in the international student market, and they're not going to be there forever, and I need to translate them into a long filter. And so we are doing that way. And whether or not you can say it's ethical or not, it's an interesting question. There's some, I want to make sure students who come here and pay top value for my classes get a world-class education. And hand on heart, if you come to ANU, you pay your international student fees, you're going to get a better deal at ANU than you do go to the United States. So or probably Canada or the UK. I really do believe that. So I don't feel too bad about it, but there are rents in that bit. There certainly are.
Thank you. We're just going to go to questions from the audience in just a minute, and we have a little over 600 people in the audience right now. I wanted to say thank you all for coming along and being a part of this discussion and submitting your questions. Like I say, we'll come to them in a minute, but Andrew, I just wanted to ask you briefly about the impact of one government policy, and this was excluding universities from the JobKeeper program. Can you talk a little bit about what the impact of that has been and what the supposed rationale for that move may have been?
Look, I think the rationale was that the government regards universities as, quasi-public institutions, and fully publicly institutions didn't get any JobKeeper. None of them got any JobKeeper. But universities are in this kind of weird hybrid state. So there were several changes. Probably only one of them was probably genuinely unfair, which is that the revenue loss had to be counted over a 6-month period rather than a 1 month or a quarter period. However, look, if money was going to be spent helping universities with COVID, I don't think it should have gone through JobKeeper, because the reality is that only some universities would have qualified, whatever the criteria had ended up being. So even if it had been favourable to unis, not all of them would have qualified for a 30% reduction in revenue under any time period, which really would have meant that there would have been a non-strategic transfer of funds to a small number of universities, whereas the $1 billion through the research support program, I think actually does target the money to where it is needed, rather than the more random spread we would have got through JobKeeper. So if the government had done this coherently, I think they could have avoided all these problems. Say JobKeeper is not the right program for universities. We're going to do something else instead.
Great. All right, on to questions from the audience. I might start with one from Alistair McCulloch, and I might ask for your take on this one, Brian. A lot of the agenda seems to be, Alistair writes, part of an ongoing attack on and diminishment of the arts, humanities, and softer social sciences in terms of both teaching and, as importantly, research. I'd be interested in hearing the panel members' views on the longer term impacts of this and how best universities can resist this.
Well, it's a really interesting piece of signaling. Let's just think of what the signaling is this year. Basically, they're saying, don't go do humanities, it's not good job prospects. But Andrew will tell you, actually, if you look at the QUILT data, which is the data that the government brings together, humanities graduates do a little better on average than science graduates. So our incoming students are not dumb. They actually do look at the data. Furthermore, a year from now, when students have forgotten about this year, they go through and say, okay, if I do a humanities degree, I got to pay more. Now, an economist knows there's a price signaling. I'm a Pinot Noir maker. You want to sell your Pinot Noir, you don't lower the price, you raise it, because people are very, very price conscious, and they are on degrees as well. So I think there is a short-term signaling that is being made. If I'm really honest, the government, by giving me $14,500 a year for my humanities students, I actually can give them a good education for that within the cap. So they've actually made it easy for me to train more humanities. They're going to allow me to put more money into humanities. And that's why, as Andrew said, it was not a policy that made sense compared to their intent. So I'm here to tell you, I run one of the best humanities programs in the world. Literally top 10 in the world. This has made it easier for me to keep that program going. Now, my students are paying more money, and they say that's not fair, and they're almost certainly correct, but they still get a return on their education dollar at greater than 10 to 1. And so, yes, it's not fair, but don't be stupid and not do it. Come do your degree at ANU, get a great outcome, learn what you want. So it's one of these things where it's a storm in a teacup, really. And I know it just looks awful and all these things, but the reality is it actually allows me to be a stronger humanities program, not a weaker one.
The next question comes from Tamara Martin, and it also looks at the cost of education. Andrew, maybe could you reflect on this? She says Germany offers free education across a group of its universities, including elite universities. And she says she supports Brian's comment on inexpensive education being essential, and I don't see why we cannot do this with industry and government support whilst maintaining a high standard. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about maybe examples of models from overseas when it comes to funding, such as free education, and what we can learn from them?
I think the main thing we learn is that higher education funding systems integrate with broader tax and welfare systems. And so the countries with relatively high tax bases, including Germany and Scandinavia and other European countries, tend to make higher education free or very cheap, along with other social services. And the countries with slightly smaller tax bases, like Australia or the United States or the UK or Japan or Canada, tend to make higher education something they charge for at varying rates. And I think the difficulty is if you try and have policies that are inconsistent with the broader system, it doesn't work. And so if Australia went to free or much, much cheaper higher education, the reality is that our participation rates would drop significantly because the government would still ration how much it's spent, and inevitably there would be lower attainment rates. And we actually see this, the relatively high fee countries typically have more people going to university than the low fee countries, because that eases the fiscal cap on how much you can spend on higher education. So it needs to be a much bigger change than just free higher education if you want to go down that path and have it sustainable and effective.
Your comments about the tax base remind me of a body of work that we published around 2 weeks ago out of our Nordic Policy Centre, which our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff, compared the economies of 188 countries around the world, looking at their rates of taxation and then comparing that to human well-being and also happiness and GDP growth, and found that the higher taxing nations, which also, like you say, have free education and a whole range of other benefits, surprise, surprise, turned out to be some of the happiest and healthiest nations in the world. And there was a strong correlation between the strength of the tax base and the strength of the community and economy. So it's an interesting point you make. Richard, you're back. Richard's Zoom crashed briefly there, but he's managed to reboot and rejoin us, which is great. I wanted to ask you a question that's been sent in from John Neve. He says, what does government funding cuts and increases in university fees tell you about how education in general is prioritized in this country? I might just add on there, considering that situation, Australia, has a history of an economy that's based on digging things up and sending them overseas. What role will the universities need to play if we're going to switch that to a smarter, more dynamic economy?
Yeah, well, luckily we switched it about 100 years ago. It's just that word hasn't got out. I mean, of course, Australia's got a bigger share of the world coal industry than Saudi Arabia has in oil. We've got a bigger share of the iron ore market than all of OPEC has in oil. Australia as a continent, we've got a continent with only 25 million people on it. Luckily for us, our continent is full of scarce resources that the rest of the world wants. And yep, a whole 2% of Australians are employed in digging that up and shipping it off. 2%. That's slightly more than 1, just a little less than 3. But in Australia, we seem convinced that all of us owe all of our prosperity. The other 98% of jobs are apparently somehow based on the work that these 2% of people do. So we left the dig it up economy behind a long time ago. We just haven't left behind the insecurity. We haven't left behind the confidence to say, well, actually, the biggest employers in Australia are our health sector. The biggest employers in many regions are our universities. If you want to create jobs, spend more money on health and education. It works a treat. We're not confident enough to say that yet. Maybe in another 100 years we might get there. But in terms of our priorities, well, the beautiful thing about the budget, we get one about every year. I used to say every year, but this year it's a bit late. We get about one a year. And it literally maps out our priorities. It literally tells us what our priorities are. It says how much we spend on some things relative to others. It tells us this year, what are we spending more on and what are we spending less on? So yeah, look, there's no doubt that in recent decades, we've shifted our priorities away from public investment in education. We've shifted away. We have other priorities. We want to spend $300 billion on submarines, and that's okay. And we want to subsidize coal mines. Well, that's okay. It's a democracy. Our budget makes clear that we now rely on individuals putting a lot more into education, and as a result, we collectively can put less in. And as Brian and Andrew have said, there's no right way of doing this. The American system looks quite different to the Swedish system, looks quite different from our system. But the one thing we should be able to agree on is our priorities, because that's literally what the budget documents for us. But given that we can't agree that 98% of us don't work in mining, we shouldn't be surprised that we can't agree. The budget papers make clear that higher education research in particular is not a priority. Attaching the word priority to something is different from putting a lot more money into it. And politicians in Australia figured out years ago, you just say something's a priority and then you give money to something else. It's that way you make two groups of people happy with the same bundle of dollars.
Thank you, Richard. The next question I'll ask of Brian. It comes from Rokio Otoya from SBS Spanish. He asks, ANU had a pilot program to bring back the international students to campus that was, I believe, suspended after the second wave of COVID in Melbourne. Would it be possible to bring back the international students to Australia after a 14-day isolation and quarantine in centres like in the Northern Territory early next year? Also, when will the international students come back to campus?
Well, so the answer is we are obviously, for the sake of our students, trying to figure out how to get them back on our campus. It is interesting. Our students are not really thrilled about the flexibility of Zoom. They've said, yeah, that's cool. Let's get back on campus. So they're really keen to get back on campus, interestingly, which is good. That means my business model persists post disruption of COVID-19. So there are a lot of moving pieces, okay? So the Victorian second wave made life very challenging, but as we are now moving into, I think, a time where the appetite of how we do quarantine can be made more sensible, we are looking absolutely with the ACT government, with the federal government about how we can map out something, and we need to do it at scale, right? I mean, there's literally 100,000 students who need to get back here, and we can't even get 25,000 of our own citizens back right now. So I think Australians probably have a right to say our citizens should be prioritized. It's hard for me to argue that, but there are things that we can do at scale, but we need to think like engineers and say, how are we going to repatriate people? So that's what we're doing. And I happen to have Tracy Smart here at ANU. She is an aeronautical medical doctor. She was the former head she was the Armed Forces chief surgeon. And she's coming in and thinking at scale about how we can do this at scale. And she was the person who managed to create the AFL bubble pretty successfully. And it's just thinking outside the normal paradigm. So we're doing it. Do I have any dates for you? Nope. We're thinking about how to do it. And then there's a whole bunch of political things that have to happen. We got to see how the epidemic plays out. There's a vaccine that may come in. So we're trying to do as fast as we can.
Right. Andrew, I've got a question here from Angela Maharaj. She says, maybe there is opportunity here to change our international student model so it's less mercenary. Instead of feeding the overseas brain drain and prestige culture in our nearest neighbours, is there a way we can genuinely collaborate with overseas universities without it reeking of neo-colonialism for mutual benefit? Could you reflect on that a little bit?
I think these kinds of more reciprocal things do happen at the research level, but I think for undergraduate and postgraduate coursework, I think the reality is that, except for a few exceptions with developing countries, international education is a commercial market and will not happen on anything like its current scale unless it is a commercial market. Because the universities, as Brian said, they are doing this to make money for research. That's their overriding objective in doing it. And something that is more about diplomacy or development is not going to have the same appeal. It's not to say the two things are mutually exclusive. Like, we do have programs for free courses for people from developing countries, but I think that will always be a relatively small part of the international education enrolments.
Richard, I might ask for you to put your Nostradamus hat on and predict what's going to happen in the future, if you don't mind. We talked about how significant education is to the Australian economy. A part of that is Australia's reputation as a high achiever in education. Do you think that the great upheaval that's happening internationally will present as a long-term problem for that situation, or might Australia emerge from this stronger?
Yeah, well, let's start with what the science of economics has to offer, and that is zero ability to predict the future. None. I'm choosing my words carefully here. Let's imagine it's 1995. I've just started my first academic job at Newcastle Uni. There is no broadband. So we're looking down the track. We're trying to build a university. We're trying to predict in 1995 where the world's going to be. There's not only no broadband, there's certainly no smartphones. So let's just be crystal clear. No one has a capacity to say, oh, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time, here's how it's going to be. The one thing I'd say that I think is going to be the biggest challenge for the kind of modern university market and international students, the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity is actually identity verification and identity fraud. Because basically anyone can enroll in someone's name and do a lot of assignments for them. And this can be done on mass scale around the world. And all unis sort of struggle with this. So I think that as India, as China, as Bangladesh, as Indonesia, as these enormously populous countries want to put their hundreds of millions of people through what we think of as a university system in the coming decades, what we do in Australia just doesn't scale fast enough. Now, we can either accumulate a really profitable niche and kind of let all, literally the hundreds of millions of people, the growth is going to be extraordinary. We can either grab onto a niche and let that other stuff kind of evolve, or we can try and take a slice of that enormous growth, but how we deliver the services, how we do the quality assurance, how we make sure that the person that says they wrote the essay, how we do that at scale, delivered online in enormous numbers. No one knows sitting here today how that's going to look, but how individual institutions and how individual countries position themselves to either protect themselves from that threat or take advantage of that opportunity will dominate the global market. But no, the big name unis, your Oxfords, your Cambridges, your ANUs, are not going to be able to educate 100 million people each. But the scale of the demand for what we think of as tertiary education is going to grow so fast, it's probably impossible for us to imagine.
Brian, we have a question here from Samson. What do panelists think about many universities' top-tier administrators paying themselves corporate salaries and bonuses and not taking a pay cut in the current circumstances? As the person in the hot seat, I thought maybe you'd be well placed to answer that one.
Well, again, I'm probably the wrong person to ask on this one, given my stance of not doing that. I'm a member of the ANU staff, and I will be, and I'm quite remarkable right now. My take-home pay is less than when I was a professor before I started being a vice-chancellor, due to taxes and super and all the other things that happen. And I can tell you, it's a hard job. I think, again, you have to decide what type of institution you are. If you're going to be running a 100,000 person higher education institution, it's not an ANU. An ANU is a community very closely knit. It's about training future academics. It's about it's not about being mass anything. So it doesn't have the same corporate structures that you have if you want to train 100 million people. And the 100 million people is going to be it may be a nonprofit, but it's going to be a commercial operation to get the scaling up right. And so I'm loath to criticize my colleagues for taking large salaries when they're semi-commercial operations, and they're not completely. And you take what a CEO makes, take the size of the operation and divide by 5. And that's what a vice chancellor makes. And it's still a huge amount of money. I mean, I'll be honest, I make more money than I want. And I'm basically the lowest paid vice chancellor in Australia right now. So they just don't care about money. But other people do. And they're running semi-commercial operations. And so I'm sorry to say, universities are not all the same, and they're not some sort of glorified little enclave of idolism like they used to be. They have to cater at scale, and they need to operate. Some of them need to operate differently. So maybe not the answer people want to hear, but I think there are places for ANU, and if you're going to run ANU, you don't make $1 million a year. You just don't, or you shouldn't. But I'm afraid if you're going to run a mass institution, you probably deserve to, because the people who need to run those are going to be the same people running major corporations. And I don't think major corporations should get as much money as they do, but they do. I just don't see how you're going to have the imbalance.
No, can I just
jump in there?
Yeah, look, again, I think Australia's so lucky to have not just Brian at ANU, but someone like Brian just saying what he just said. I'm not doing it for the money. I think that's wonderful. And a lot of people watching this today work in jobs where they don't do it for the money. It's not uncommon. I don't work at a not-for-profit think tank to maximize my income. So lots of Australians think like what Brian just said. Lots of Australians act like that. But of course, in Australia, in public debate, we're told the opposite. We're told you're a sucker if you're not out there trying to grab everything you can as quick as you can. So I think we as a community need to know that what Brian said might be rare to hear from a vice chancellor, but it's not rare for medical doctors to do what they think is important work rather than profitable work. It's not rare for accountants and lawyers to go and work for NGOs where they think they do good. This is what lots of Australians do. But if we're going to talk about these universities that are behaving like businesses and who are paying their CEOs if they're a business, well, then we need to be clear about the distinction. They're quite different. And that we as a society, on the one hand, we have to be careful how we invest status and how we invest trust in institutions, because you can't have it both ways. You can't say I'm paying my CEO on commercial rates because they're just there to get as much money as they can for them and their institution. Those same institutions lose credibility when they turn around and say, won't the government please help me? You can't have it both ways. And this cuts to the heart of what I'm saying is the fundamental confusion in Australia about what the role of a university is and what we want it to be. There's no right answers, but there are wrong answers, and the wrong answers are deeply inconsistent about, are they there to make a lot of money for someone, or are they there to help the community? They can't be both.
Great, thank you for that contribution, Richard. And it's brought us through to the time to end the webinar. We'll have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much to our panel, Professor Brian Schmidt, Professor Andrew Norton, and to you, Richard. Thank you to everyone for your great questions. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them today. And also, please join us over the next few weeks as we roll out more exciting webinars. Next Wednesday's webinar will be a special one. It's accompanying the launch of our annual Climate of the Nation report. Climate of the Nation is the longest continuous study of community attitudes towards climate change in the country, and it's now in its 13th year. Details for that webinar, as well as recordings for all of our previous webinars from this series, are available at our website, tai.org.au/webinars. I think the details for next week's webinar are up. If they're not, they will be soon. You should also make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money, or you can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. And finally, as Ebony says at the end of each webinar, please stay safe out there, everyone. Keep 1.5 meters away from each other, wash those hands, and remember to look after each other. Thanks, and see you next week. Thank you all.